Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today. So, after World War II, France is faced with a quandary about hey, how do we still try and maintain influence and prestige in this new world where all of a sudden the Soviet Union and the Americans are the superpowers and former European powers like us face irrelevancy and stagnation? So, this is the dawn of what's known as the French community. So, as I've talked about a bit, colonial territories in France were often still seen as being part of metropolitan France. They weren't overseas territories like the British had, they were actual considered departments of France, and they sent representatives to the French Legislative Assembly. Now, Sir Charles de Gaulle, who became president of France in the wake of World War II, and after the birth of what I believe is the French Fifth Republic, because the fourth one didn't work out so well, the whole Vichy thing in World War II and all that, he still wanted France to have an influential role in North, West, and Equatorial Africa. And he felt that if they continued to do this, then France could continue to be a relevant global player by maintaining a sort of lever of control in Africa. Now, he did this by organizing a French community, which involved closer economic ties, financial ties, military ties, linguistic, cultural, religious ties, etc. And so a lot of nations, particularly in French West Africa, were okay with this. Some, like Algeria, said, no, thank you, independence now, please. But some liked the initial idea, but were still understandably hesitant about how far the French hand of influence would reach. And so the French community always kind of had a bit of a rocky start and wasn't really that good. And it ended fairly quickly to be replaced by subsequent versions like France Afrique, the Francophonie, which even Canada is a part of today, which is a union of various French-speaking peoples and various other observer states. That's a global institution now. But I want to focus on this notion of how the French still tried to hold on to a colonial empire and influence in a post-World War II world. This was made all the more relevant with the fact that the Soviets, somewhat understandably, used various independence movements in West Africa to try and spread the socialist revolution around the world. This is why places like Guinea-Bissau, I think Guinea, and various even rebels in parts of Ghana and Burkina Faso ended up turning socialist or communist. One such example, I'm sure some people were hoping I'd mention, is Thomas Sankara, who was a leader of Burkina Faso, who got them off of international monetary assistance from the West. More on him in a different video. But this notion of the French still trying to hold on to a colonial empire is part of what caused them a lot of grief in several ways. So some colonial powers post-World War II were done with. So Italy, they had their possessions taken and they were split up between the French, the British, and various international United Nations trust territories. The French still held on to theirs, and the British began a largely peaceful decolonialization period. Not saying it was good and that it didn't cause a ton of problems, but they didn't fight to hold on to it. Portugal and France, however, still fought to hold on to their colonial empires, which they still insisted were actually just parts of their country. But if you scratch beneath the surface, they were very much colonies. They were not set up to be self-governing independent regions or institutions. They were purely to extract money for the French state and for the white French people. So this brings us back to West Africa, Equatorial Africa, and their subsequent wars of independence. Now, some managed to do it relatively peacefully, others did not. Now, I'm not going to get into this because that would just take forever to talk about the various independence movements in Guinea, Ivory Coast, Chad, Benin, Mali, Senegal, Mauritania. There's a lot there. We don't have time for that. I want to hit the broad strokes and why this notion of still trying to hold influence bothers me and how it sets it up for the current state of affairs in terms of the war on terror in West Africa. So when you have a community that you're trying to build, um, it's important that the community feels that it's actually a respected part and has a voice within this community you're trying to propose. A lot of West African states didn't, which is why you see various attempts at some form of regional unification. There was Senegal and the Gambia at one point. There was Senegal and Mali at one point. Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso were briefly united much earlier on during the French colonial period. There were some attempts, but nothing really stuck. And so this idea of a French West African community with trying to create a common market and using a standardized currency were really good ideas. But of course, the people couldn't always agree with each other because the borders had been drawn so hastily. Without getting too much into the modern stuff, Mali has two very different regions. The northeastern half of the country is largely Tuareg and Muslim. The western half of the country is largely black and Christian. This is the same for a lot of nations around that area. Niger, Senegal, Burkina Faso even. And as we're seeing as well in Nigeria, this is something that plagues most of West Africa along the Sahel. And so this is where you get a lot of conflicts early on in the 50s and 60s. And since these economies and governments were only ever set up to extract wealth for Europeans, there wasn't a system to really manage infrastructure in an acceptable way and allow for public engagement with the governments that supposedly represented them. This means that at the end of the day, only strongmen could really rise to the top. And then they had to take their money and bribe the other generals and colonels and captains to keep them in power lest they be couped themselves. And the French were obviously a big part of this because if they recognized their governments, then that is how authoritarianism can be legitimized and come to stay permanent. And so because of this community, so long as various strongmen promised not to upset the apple cart of European wealth extraction, then they would be allowed to govern without intervention. But if they didn't agree, or if they bungled the situation so much that it forced intervention, then Western powers got involved. This is ultimately part of how Thomas Sankara fell to outside forces and a coup that overthrew him. This is how the French continue to be involved militarily in the port of Dakar in Senegal. They're continually involved in Mali, running operations through Niger and in Chad so that they can still keep an eye on the Sahara and North Africa and West Africa and Central Africa. This is how it continues. And it's just colonialism by another name. That's all it is. It is just another form of colonialism for the French to try and extract some measure of influence because they fear the rising influential powers. The Cold War is gone from Africa now, so American and Soviet influence has very much dwindled on the continent. But then things changed. Things began to really change in the 90s with the fall of the Soviet Union, and then again in the 2000s with the War on Terror. And this video is already getting a little long, so I think we're going to have to save the collapse of the Soviet Union and the War on Terror for tomorrow's video. But the fact that, once again, even in defeat and humbled by a completely destructive war, France and the powers that led it still saw fit to try and maintain imperialism over nearly half of a continent because they felt entitled to. It was entitlement at, well, we've always been a power, so we should continue to be a power, right? And millions of Africans have had to suffer because of this. And the fact that we don't recognize this and push back against this and react with disdain when African leaders like Thomas Sankara dare to show their own independence and success, that when we hate that, yet we claim to stand for it, that is what's bothering me today.